right. Well, good morning, guys. It is good to be back to Biola. As Brother Ronnie said in the introductions, I graduated from here. It was almost, I want to say about 9 years ago, to end of 2013, I believe. And so I remember sitting in different classes and listening to the different professors and all that, and now here we are with the ministry and doing our first conference. So what an incredible blessing it is to be back over here. I am from Tulsa, Oklahoma, much warmer over there, and so I'm grateful to be here. It is a nice day. It's a little warm here, but really not too bad compared to where I'm from. My name is Prashanth Daniel again. I'm the president and founder of Reasonable Truth. And our talk for today is titled The Worldview Paradigm. Now, obviously, we're going to unpack this pretty well. But before we do that, I think it's vital that we kind of lay the groundwork for what we mean by a worldview. All right. So I want to begin with two stories. Indians love stories. I'm originally an Indian, okay? We like to begin everything with stories, so I'm going to start with two stories, not just one, all right? So the first one is this. It's a more personal story for me. I'm originally from India, but I was born and raised in the Middle East, in the country of Bahrain. My wife is American. She was born in Missouri and has lived there for most of her life, and except for a few years when she traveled to India and met this dashingly handsome guy and married him. But I remember this one time, shortly after we were married, I was working on a little project. I was typing up a formal letter that I wanted to send over to somebody, and you know how you got to screen everything through the wife, right? And so I typed out this letter and I sent it to her, and I was like, hey, can you take a look at this? Just make sure that everything looks good. And she started reading the letter. And her eyes kind of narrowed a little bit as soon as she saw that, and then she said, "Everything looks fine, but I would just swap out the first and the second paragraph." Now this was kind of strange to me. This didn't make sense to me, and I was like, "Why? What's going on?" And she said, "Well, you started off on a personal note, and then you got to business. I would start off with the formal, and then end on a personal note. That's the only thing. Otherwise, your letter looks great." All right, now she said this, and I'm thinking, no, that doesn't make sense. As someone from India, which is a very communal culture, I have a few Indian brothers in here today who will understand, it made perfect sense to begin on a personal note, establish a societal, communal element of connection before transitioning to formal matters. I was, after all, writing to someone who was Indian, and but for my wife, though, this didn't make sense. This was primarily a formal letter as far as she was concerned, and it made sense to get straight to the point and then end with personal small talk. So here's the question. Who is right? Second story. Yes, this is being recorded, so I'm going to concur with that. Yeah, so the second story is the business meeting, all right? John, a European businessman, flew to Tokyo for a high-level meeting with Mr. Kisagi, a Japanese businessman who was the head of a major company. It was a long trip, and John wanted to make sure he made the most of this meeting. And he knew that the Japanese were very big on punctuality, and so as soon as he landed there, he took a cab straight from the airport to Mr. Kisagi's office. He waited for a few minutes in the office lounge, and then the secretary came in, and she was like, "All right, Mr. Kisagi's ready to see you." So John walks in, he shakes his hand, and he says, "Mr. Kisagi, so good to see you. I've been looking forward to this meeting for a while now." And Mr. Kisagi responds, "Very good to see you too, John. How was your flight? I'm sure it must have been a long journey." Right? And John's like, "It was fine. It wasn't too bad at all. Anyways, if you're ready, we can go ahead and get started on the presentation." And Mr. Kisagi just kind of waves, dismisses it, and he's like, "All right, yeah, but what were your first impressions of Japan?" And John says, "Oh, it was really beautiful. I mean, the drive here was very scenic, and Mount Fuji looks stunning in person. Anyways, getting back to the presentation, would you like to take a look at the paperwork before we get started?" And Mr. Kisagi waves his hand again, and he's like, "Yeah, we'll get to that, but would you like some traditional Japanese tea?" It'll really help you relax and kind of get you over your jet lag. And John's like, all right, that sounds great. I would like that very much. And John hands Mr. Kisagi the paperwork. And Mr. Kisagi takes the paperwork, he puts it on his desk, and he says, so John, how is your family doing? You guys see what's going on over here? John, because he's on a formal business trip, wants to be efficient with his time and not waste Mr. Kisagi's time. And so he seems intent on getting straight to the point and maximizing the efficiency of this meeting. Nothing wrong with that, right? Mr. Kisagi, on the other hand, sees John as a guest because John made this long trip across the ocean to come meet him and wants to make sure he's given a warm welcome and hospitality before they get into anything formal. Their intentions for each other are both mutually respectful, but their approaches seem to be slightly at odds with what each one is trying to accomplish. So once again, I ask you, who is right? Let's lay the landscape for worldviews, keeping those stories in mind. In both of these stories, we get a small glimpse into how a cultural worldview shapes the way people operate or make decisions. Western culture tends to be very, very time-oriented, very productivity-oriented, efficiency-oriented. Eastern culture, on the other hand, tends to be very socially or communally oriented, hospitality-oriented, very relational. But does this difference necessarily tell us which cultural worldview is better? I don't think it does. I think it points to areas that each culture lays, and where each culture lays an extra emphasis on, but doesn't necessarily demonstrate the superiority or inferiority of either cultural worldview. But both these examples show just one factor that shapes worldview, and that's namely culture. Typically, when we talk about worldviews, we tend to categorize them largely based on ideological differences. But worldviews can actually be defined by numerous factors, such as family upbringing, age, socioeconomic status, interpersonal relationships, phenomenological experiences, gender, geographical context, and to some extent, even genetics. Now, obviously, some of those categories influence you to higher degrees than others. But all of those influence you to some extent and through certain seasons of your life. Some sociologists also say that your fundamental worldview can change, sometimes more than once during your life. Factors such as geographical context or phenomenological experiences can be influential agents of change that can cause a relatively quick shift in worldview. So let's look at worldview shapers, contents, and influences, okay? These factors influence primarily three areas of your worldview: the cognitive, the moral, and the pragmatic. The cognitive. This has to do with how we think. Everything else flows from this. How you think about something will dictate what you do with it. Your decision-making and your emotions. How many of you have noticed, you look around at your culture and you're like, well, this looks kind of crazy. People are saying and doing things that are against the grain of conventional wisdom. This is because I would say people literally don't know how to think anymore. Everything begins with the cognitive. Number two, moral. This has to do with how we discern between right and wrong. And it is connected to how we think. If we think something is morally all right, even though it is morally wrong, then we will discern incorrectly and make morally wrong decisions. This is fairly elementary. And third point is pragmatic. That brings us to what we do with what is right and wrong. And in this component, if our cognitive is not oriented correctly, we will estimate hierarchical levels of morality and we'll end up with a sort of ends justify the means sort of ethic. So one's worldview consists of your metaphysics, your epistemology, your theology, your anthropology, your axiology. So let me translate all of that, okay? In short, your worldview comprises of A, your view of human nature. Are humans fundamentally good? Are they fundamentally bad? Or are they, as some people would say, tabula rasa? Are they like a blank slate? Second, your worldview dictates your perspective of life in general. Is life supposed to be meaningful? Is it supposed to be hedonistic or pleasureful? Or is it nihilistic? Number three, your equality with and responsibility to other people. Are relationships ethically bound? Are they transactional? Or are they utilitarian in nature? Number four, your perspective of an individual's relationship to the state. This is kind of the JFK question, right? Not what can your country do for you, but what you can do for your country. What does our relationship look like with the state? Number five, your perspective of the individual's relationship with nature. Are we stewards of the world? Does the world exist for our consumption? Or is it a bit of both? And lastly, how do we think about sources of wisdom? Do we learn from those who lived before us? Do we learn from authoritative institutions? Or do we create and follow our own wisdom? In short, your worldview influences and impacts not only how you perceive the world around you, but how you interact and engage with the world around you. And this is why, for all practical purposes, whenever we see an idea at work in culture, politics, entertainment, education, or any other sphere of influence, it's always good to ask ourselves this question: what worldview is at work here? Let's look at the Western philosophical worldview. In order to truly understand or engage in a thorough analysis of any worldview or ideology in particular, it is paramount that we first understand a bit of its genesis. While this may be relevant to those of us here in the West, it's certainly not relegated just to us. In fact, in our examination of worldview shifts, it is important to be cognizant of the fact that any obvious shift we see in the culture actually never begins there to start with, and are mere symptoms of tectonic changes in what I call a meta-worldview, a larger, intangible, non-empirical rubric that governs all tangible and visible shifts. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor articulates the shift in meta-worldviews when he engages with the Greek concepts of mimesis and poiesis, which are basically two different ways of thinking about the world. So what is mimesis? This is the view that the world has a given order. It has a given structure. There is already a built-in meaning. And as humans living within that ordered structure, we are required to discover that meaning and to conform ourselves to it. In other words, the world we live in is bigger than us and has a distinct telos, or purpose. We are smaller cogs within that larger order, and we must find a way to align ourselves with this in order to discover our own telos. Does that make sense? That's a mimetic worldview. Let's talk about poiesis. By contrast, poiesis is the view that everything in this world is mere data or raw material which can be harnessed, manipulated, or used for our own consumption as we please. Within this view, there is no larger telos that we must adhere to, but rather we can create our own telos, or even choose to have no telos if we so desire. Charles Taylor makes the contention that the primary shift that has taken place and is more obvious in the Western culture is society's move from once having a mimetic view of the world to now predominantly having a poetic view of the world. If Taylor's contention is right, and I think it is, then we as a society have lost the significance of discovering our telos in the grandeur of a world bigger than us, because we have shifted to a paradigm of creating our own telos by shaping the world in our own grandeur. All right, so how did this happen? What's the cause for this mimetic to poetic shift? So what exactly caused this shift in a meta worldview? Dr. Carl Trueman, who's an eminent church historian and professor of biblical and religious studies at Grove City College, traces this shift in his fantastic book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. In his book, Trueman notes that the predominant cause for this shift can actually be attributed to technological advances. Listen to what he says here, quote, "To make this point more clearly, one might reflect on the nature of life in medieval Europe, a predominantly agrarian society. Given what agricultural technology was by then, by today's standards, relatively primitive, farming was utterly dependent on geography and the seasons. These were givens. While the farmer would plow up the ground and scatter the seed, he had no control over the weather, minimal control over the soil, and thus comparatively little control over whether his endeavors would succeed. That might well have meant for many that they had no control over life or death. They were entirely at the mercy of the environment. In such a world, the authority of the created order was obvious and unavoidable. The world was what it was, and the individual needed to conform to it. Sowing seed in December or harvesting crops in March was doomed to failure. Yet, with the advent of more advanced agricultural technology, this given authority of the environment became increasingly attenuated. The development of irrigation meant that water could be moved or stored and then used when necessary. Increased knowledge of soil science and fertilizers and pesticides meant that the land could be manipulated to yield more and better crops. More controversially, the recent development of genetics has allowed for the production of foods that are immune to certain conditions or parasites. I could go on, but the point is clear. Whether we consider certain innovations to be good or bad, technology affects in profound ways how we think about the world and imagine our place in it. Today's world is not the objectively authoritative place that it was 800 years ago." End quote. Do you see what Trueman is saying here? Prior to the types of technology that exist today, man had very little control over even the daily affairs of his life. His life had to be in sync with the rhythm of the natural world, a world much bigger and more powerful than him. This world had governing parameters in place that man needed to work around, and whatever came of his efforts was the hand he was dealt and had no choice but to contend with. But with the advancement of technology, man began to gain a greater control over the world around him. No longer was he at the mercy of the elements or the rhythm of the natural world. And the more control he gained over his environment, the less intimidating and smaller this world seemed to him. Now, I would contend that this shift in the scales for man's dominance over the world is not entirely a negative thing. We were, after all, meant to have dominion over the world, and man's ability to use his intelligence and resourcefulness to counter the ill effects of an atrophying world is largely a good and useful thing. I'm sure we are all grateful for the inventions and discoveries that have made our lives a better place, like the wheel, the light bulb, penicillin, prosthetics, and lately computers. The value that these inventions have brought to the betterment of our world cannot be overstated. But in the course of man gaining such dominance over the world, there was not only an external shift in the maneuvering of the tangible world around us, but also an internal shift that began to change man's understanding of his own telos. As the scales of control began to tilt towards man's favor, the world and everything in it no longer seemed to be a model that needed to be fit into, but rather a mold that could be shaped into a model of our own choice. This shift from a mimetic to a poetic paradigm began to govern not only our pursuits or ambitions, but also our perspective of ourselves. Thus began the subtle but quick process of the internalization of one's value and place in the world. You're going to start to see this slow progression from our perspective of the outside to our perspective of the inside. We see this played out in human history from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment era, where man became the apex of all truth and his ideals became the summum bonum of all reality. Francis Schaeffer, the eminent American theologian and philosopher, summed up this utopian dream of the Enlightenment in 5 words: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. In other words, a system that was thoroughly secular in its thinking. I think Schaeffer's right, because the logical result of embracing a poetic worldview is the loss of a sense of transcendence. This line of thinking becomes evident when you study the works of some eminent thinkers of our time. René Descartes, the French philosopher whom many would consider the father of modern philosophy, thought that human reason and thought alone was completely sufficient to question all notions of authority. Remember that it was Descartes who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes has been dead for over 370 years, but his philosophy is alive and rampant today. And we see it in our culture's confusion over gender and biological sex. When you hear someone say, "I'm a man trapped in a woman's body," or "I identify as something," understand that there is a Cartesian worldview at work here. That who or what I think of myself cognitively is what ultimately matters and is not or should not be influenced by any form of biological reality. In other words, one's internal reality supersedes any and all external reality. My point here is not to say that there are no legitimate mental health issues or that the struggle of cognitive deficiencies is not real. But the point is that when one holds to a worldview that positions oneself not only as the center of all reality, but also the singular source that dictates all reality, then it is only logical to come to the conclusion that I think, therefore I am. Let's look at another person, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the 18th century French-speaking Swiss philosopher who famously said, "Man was born free, but everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau saw the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and believed that it caused a form of ideological restraint from true autonomous freedom. For Rousseau, reason itself was a sort of chain that restrained man to societal norms, rules, governments, and any structure that resembled authority. Consequently, then, Rousseau saw autonomous freedom not as freedom towards something, but as freedom from. Most importantly, freedom from God or the Bible. Another influential person who epitomized this worldview was the Scottish philosopher David Hume, who I believe was a peer of Rousseau. Hume also criticized reason as a method of knowing truth and defended the centrality of human experience and feeling. Hume, in turn, was influential on the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant, also disillusioned by the pursuit of reason, penned 3 very influential books titled The Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and Critique of Judgment. Not exactly subtle titles that mask his true opinion of reason. So, how do we process all this? The worldview, up until the Enlightenment era, posited a unity or harmony between the individual's telos and reason. Telos on one side, reason on the other side. The rationalistic thinkers of old believed, from a mimetic worldview, that there was an intrinsic connection between meaning or values and the world of rationality. But the humanistic worldview that led to a disillusionment of reason created a bifurcation between those two. Francis Schaeffer describes this well. He says, quote, "Modern man is a man of dichotomy. By dichotomy, we mean a total separation into 2 reciprocally exclusive orders with no unity or relationship between them. The dichotomy here is the total separation between the area of meaning and values and the area of reason. Reason leading to despair must be kept totally separate from the blind optimism of non-reason. This makes a lower and upper story, with the lower story of reason leading to pessimism and men trying to find optimism in the upper story devoid of reason. This is the mark of modern man." End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, I think Schaeffer's assessment here is spot on. The pessimism of reason has given way to the blind optimism of non-reason. Do you look around you today and ask, has everybody lost their minds? Does it seem like facts, data, and evidence simply don't seem to matter anymore? You'd be right, because there is a blind optimism at work here, a utopian experiment in progress, an ideological Tower of Babel under construction. Reason or rationality is just an inconvenient obstacle to the blind optimism of non-reason. It would be too simplistic to say that our culture has merely gone mad. Our culture is reaping the consequences of adopting a worldview that has positioned oneself at the center of our universe while evicting anything that is transcendent and everything that is rational. But in one sense, such a worldview is madness. It is insanity guised as liberation or progress. But what is the ultimate source of transcendence? What is the embodiment of reason and truth? The unlikeliest of persons, German atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and in my opinion, probably the last truly honest atheist, prognosticated accurately of the insanity that would follow if we evicted that embodiment of transcendence in reason. Listen to what Nietzsche says in the parable of the madman, and this may be familiar to many of you. Quote, "The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Where is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We've killed him. You and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's decomposed too. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" Here, the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last, he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said then. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men." End quote. Poignant, very poignantly said, isn't it? Nietzsche accurately prophesied that evicting God, if such a God truly existed, would result in chaos, anarchy, and insanity. In a twisted and ironic self-fulfilling prophecy, Nietzsche himself lived out the last few years of his life literally insane. But I think he correctly diagnosed that our pursuit to become like God would lead us to evict everything that has a semblance of the divine. And in turn, the eviction of the divine would perpetuate our pursuit of self-proclaimed divinity. The eerie voice in the garden that then said, "You too can be like God," was not merely a call to disobedience or rebellion. It was the implantation of a demonic worldview that would plunge humankind into the suicidal pursuit of attempting to make the world and everything in it in our own image. Ladies and gentlemen, we see all kinds of movements around us that are driven by subtle worldviews. When we see cultural statistics on the significant drop in marriage and childbearing, we are seeing a worldview that depicts marriage and childbearing as inconvenient liabilities that get in the way of personal pursuits. When we see the pro-choice movement advocate for the termination of the unborn, we are seeing a worldview that elevates personal choice and bodily autonomy over the completely natural and biological result of procreation. When we see the attempt to deliberately obfuscate basic biological differences in gender, we are seeing a worldview that seeks to enshrine one's own ability to define one's biological identity apart from biological reality. When we see a culture that seeks to pursue every other form of sexual union outside of monogamous marriage, we are seeing a worldview that finds marital and sexual faithfulness to be a primitive impediment to pursuing one's own hedonistic pleasures and cravings. When we see governmental policy prescriptions that seek to minimize the personal rights of an individual, we are seeing a worldview that sees the individual as inherently less important than the institution and thereby subservient to the institution. When we see sociocultural movements that seek to create an egalitarian playing field by denigrating other people groups, we are seeing a worldview that intentionally seeks to communicate that all people are not equal and some deserve better than others. When we see educational institutions attempt to introduce propagandizing content to children or young people that are diametrically opposite to family or religious values and norms, we are seeing a worldview that denigrates the God-given authority of parents and turn their children over to the authority of secular institutions that claim to know better. I could go on, but the point is clear. What we see around us are not temporary social quirks in the culture. They're not merely governmental policies or parties that need to be defeated at the ballot boxes. And neither are they merely misinformation campaigns being spearheaded by media elites. What we see around us are subtle but massive worldviews at work. Which brings us to the Christian worldview. Any worldview must answer or be able to answer certain fundamental questions in order to provide a comprehensive and coherent framework for living. Questions like, who are we? Where did we come from? Why do we exist, or what is our purpose for being? How can we tell what is right and wrong? How do we live accordingly? Is this all there is, or what can we expect after this life? A scientistic worldview would say that the questions that ultimately matter are not only scientific questions, but only questions that science can answer. But the questions that we just asked are questions that are not scientific in nature, but philosophical in nature. And humans have been grappling with those questions since the beginning of time. The Christian worldview is the only worldview that adequately answers the deepest questions of the human heart. It provides a framework and gives us the grounding for living a life that corresponds to reality. It has built-in checks and balances that acts as guardrails to keep us on a rational and meaningful path. It acts as a mirror that gives us an accurate representation of ourselves and our spiritual condition. But most importantly, it gives us the solution that liberates us from the burden of brokenness that plagues every one of us. But all of those elements can only come from that which is like, but also differs from us. That which is outside of us, but also in a sense inside of us. That which is real and empirical, but also intangible and invisible. That which is personal, but also transcendent. That is why the Bible begins with the sentence, "In the beginning, God." Right at the first sentence, the Bible establishes a worldview for us, beginning with the Creator God Himself. A God that created us so that we might have a relationship with Him, that gave us a world to live in and use for our sustenance and pleasure, relationship to produce after our own kind, a moral code by which to live, mercy that we desperately needed when we failed to live by that code, a gracious path of atonement knowing that our morals will fail, reconciliation with Himself through His Son, and an eternal hope of reigning alongside Him. The history of the world is replete with diverse worldviews that have been tried and found wanting. The Christian worldview is the only belief system that adequately gives us the necessary framework for our telos. A telos that can only be found in a transcendent yet personal God that made us for Himself and loved us enough to redeem us. Thank you. I'll just tell them. That's fine. Yeah.
Hello? All right, so at this time what we are going to do, we have so if you're looking at your schedule there, your program, we have an allotted time for Q&A. And because we've started with a bit of a delay, what we're going to do is we'll take a couple. I know there's probably some burning questions out there. What we'll do is to kind of adjust for time. We are, as Brother Prashanth here mentioned, we are in the West, so we are time oriented. So we recognize that. We want to respect your time, especially many of you were here early. And so what we'll do here, kind of calling an audible, we'll take 2 questions tops, and then you'll notice you'll have a break time that was supposed to lead up into the 2 breakout sessions. And so what we'll do is the lecturers will be in their respective rooms in Sutherland waiting. And if you need a break as you're walking out on the down the hall, left-hand side, there's restrooms, and you can enjoy the scenery on the way out. But please be on time in the breakout rooms. But at this time, again, if we have any questions, we'll open this up to Q&A in respect to the topic that was just discussed on worldview. We have a John W. with the microphone who's gonna, I don't know what the W, oh, there it is. Okay, so it's not for Wick. Of course, good Christians, we don't watch that movie. So, all right, let's see. John W. Has a microphone, and he is going to be going around. And if you have a question, you could. If you don't have any questions, I could throw one, but I'd love for you to have the opportunity to ask your question to Prashanth.
You know, I will say, if this were happening in India and we were over by like 10, 15 minutes, nobody would even blink. You know, like this is not a problem at all. So yeah, but we are time oriented here. So, well, let me just say something. If nobody actually has a question, it's really interesting how worldview impacts everything you see, everything you experience, even time. There is such a thing as the philosophy of time, you know, and I'm not talking about kind of the academic philosophy of time. I'm talking about like a cultural way of looking at time. And just to give you a little example, I've seen this in India, you know, growing up. People will show up to events late. People will randomly decide to drop in at your house and invite themselves for a meal. People will just just decide to come and pick you up and say, hey, let's go out. They don't ask you about whether you have anything planned, anything like that. But nobody's offended by that. It's a very communal, very, relational culture. And obviously, I don't have to tell you guys, it's not like that here in the West. So what's going on there? How do we perceive time? And a small analogy that I think might be helpful is that for the Easterner, for the Eastern cultural person, time is like a giant river. It's a river that will just keep moving. The waters just keep rushing. All you do is you just step into that river. You can't control the river. You can't slow it down. You can't divert the waters. You can't change the chemistry. There's nothing you can do to that river. All you do is step into it, you get wet by it, and it just goes all around you, and that's it. Does that make sense? That's how the Easterner looks at time. But the Westerner looks at that same water very differently. The Westerner looks at time as water that he can hold in his own cup. This is my water. I can do with this whatever I want. I can pour it on the ground. I can sip it. I can gulp it down. I can pour it on my head because it's mine. You see the difference? There's a cultural difference even in the philosophy of time. And so worldview, I think, is very, very important. And this is why I think it's important that I think a lot of times, especially in the culture that we live in, there's a lot of chatter. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of social issues and things like that. But oftentimes, the thing that's driving the polarization, the thing that's driving any difference is a sort of ideological difference. It's a worldview difference. And it's always important, I think, to first understand what that worldview is. What is at work in that person, in that institution, in that body, if we are truly going to understand how to deal with it. And that's going to require a little bit more homework, We can't just react. We can't just go off the cuff. We want to try to understand what's the worldview at work if we are able to engage effectively. Does that help? Does that make sense? That is true, yeah. So the question is, if for those of you who didn't hear it, is how do you make a distinction between worldview and personality? Well, I think sometimes a personality is more obvious. I know that I'm a very social guy. I'm very extroverted. Worldviews can be more subtle, and sometimes there's many layers to it. So, for example, in India, I've talked to people who, regardless of their personality, have very differing views on caste. So the caste system is a thing in India where there are actually like classifications of people groups. So for an Indian Christian like me, I would be categorized as a backward caste. Is that correct, Finney? A BC, a backward caste, I think is what the category I would be considered at. I know, that sounds really like, what? Backward caste? That's horrible. Then you have the forward caste. And you have all these different types of castes. And there are people who have very strong opinions about these things. And then there are others for whom this is not a factor at all. And so depending on where you stand on that, you can be vociferous about that, or you can be laid back about that. And the people who are vociferous about that are going to try to, they will respond in public. I've seen people have fights at banks and other just very public places about things like that on the forums, and others who are just like, it is what it is. There's nothing we can do about it. So there's both at work. There's personality at work, and there's also a worldview at work. But another important thing I think to keep in mind is in the Indian sort of Hindu pantheistic sort of culture is, and this relates to the worldview, is this idea, this kind of like a ka sara sara kind of attitude, right? It's karma. It's these things are meant to be. These things are meant to happen. There's nothing we can do about it. So again, that's a belief system. That's a worldview. So often these things work hand in hand, but I think personality tends to become more obvious, and the worldview factor is not as obvious. Does that help? Yeah. Tony.
Let me know if, here you go. All right. Well,
Can-
first of all,
can we make this our last one? So just
Yeah.
to keep on.
so an excellent sketch of our intellectual history
Thank
and
you.
why we're here. You referenced Charles Taylor, Carl Trueman's book, which references Charles Taylor a lot. I think those are very important authors, philosophers to read. So I thought that was excellent. One thing that I heard Carl Trueman say in a lecture last year that didn't quite come up in the talk, though, but would be relevant to this idea of control and sort of like ownership, right, of our own selves.
Right.
Right, and you also mentioned time, too, like I own my time.
Right.
How the role of suffering plays out in this kind of worldview that we're embedded in, where the telos seems to be in American culture that the best thing one can do is avoid pain and suffering at all costs. Not just physical pain, but any kind of emotional or psychological pain and suffering sort of has to be eliminated from our lives. And this is almost like what our politicians are trying to do. Create more and more laws so that nobody experiences any, even a semblance of discomfort.
That's right.
And I think one thing to just think about, talk about, discuss is how are we going to preach a crucified Christ who commands us to
Yeah.
take up our cross daily
Yeah.
in a culture that is hell-bent literally on avoiding suffering
Yeah.
as the ultimate goal.
Right.
So
right.
just a thought and maybe a comment.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We are anemic to a theology of suffering in the West. This is a big problem here. And I think a lot of it, I think some of it has to do with technological advancements. We have created a poetic worldview here. We have that kind of framework where we have been able to make this world and our reality in our own image. And part of that is eliminating the inconveniences, the problems, the obstacles, the hurdles, and all of those things. But in the process of doing that, we have really, we have not had the opportunity for suffering and difficulties and tribulations and persecutions to shape us and to help us grow and develop, which is part of God's plan in this fallen world. So yes, I agree, and I think this is one of the reasons. Even when you look at like evangelistic or missional sort of data and evidence like that, you actually see Christianity rising in countries and other parts of the world where there's incredible amounts of suffering, incredible amounts of pain and tribulation, and Christianity is dropping, plummeting in the West. And I think it has to do with that, the fact that we have a serious lack of a proper, robust understanding of a theology of suffering. That's right, good point.